So, as Michael said, I'm Roger Emslie from ESB in Ireland, and I suppose this is which is the Electricity Supply Board. So very much on the electricity side of things. And to complement Bruce's presentation earlier, the idea here is really to sort of compare and contrast. So looking at our strategy to get to net zero, but comparing that in a deregulated market, which Ireland now is, versus a sort of central regulated market as Bruce operates in. And I think it gives us some really interesting comparison points and lets us compare how those maybe some of the same challenges and some of the slightly different challenges that we face. So a couple of things that I want to run through, introduce ESB for those who aren't familiar with the far northwestern edge of Europe, and our net zero vision, so what that entails. I think it's important to give the context of the Irish market and the idea of the Irish market. And when I say Ireland throughout this presentation, I'm talking about the single electricity market, which is the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So when I say Ireland, I'm not making a political statement. It just means the entire electricity system. And so to talk about the journey that Ireland is on towards net zero and how we get there, our strategy as ESB for getting to net zero, and particularly focused on my part of the business, and then a little bit on just the importance of modeling to developing this strategy and how we rely and how we use and rely on models as we go through the strategy. So kicking off with who we are. The Electricity Supply Board was formed in 1927 in Ireland when they constructed, I say they because I wasn't there in 1927, constructed Ardnacrusha hydroelectric power station. It was 60 megawatts, and it was about 110% of the total demand of the country. So very small initially when we kicked things off. It is the largest vertically integrated electricity utility in Ireland, and we've got operations in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and across in Great Britain. Great Britain operates its own electricity system separate from Ireland, so it's not the UK electricity system, if you like. So our structure, we are vertically integrated. So we've got a generation and trading business generating electricity. We've got ESB Networks, which is the transmission system and distribution system owner in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I know we've got colleagues here from EirGrid, which is our transmission system operator. So they're working closely with our ESB Networks division, and then Electric Ireland and So Energy in the UK, which are our supply businesses, supplying electricity out. And then we do also have other divisions within the group. I'm going to focus on the generation side of things because that's the part of the business that I sit in, but also from a net zero perspective, I think it's valuable to focus on how we decarbonize electricity generation and that journey that we're on. So what's the current state of play? So we operate, that's where all our different assets are. We've got about 5.5 gigawatts of generation capacity, about 4.2 gigawatts in Ireland, and about 1.4 gigawatts in GB. If all of these numbers appear quite small, I'm sure I suppose we have to bear in mind the context of this market. So the whole of Ireland is less than 0.1% of global land area, less than 0.1% of global population, and heavy hitters about 0.15% of electricity consumption globally. So these numbers are relatively small, but it's in the context of a small open economy off the western edge of Europe with relatively little interconnection to the rest of the system. So that makes it interesting and challenging. We are still heavily gas focused, so fossil fuel focused. So about 75% of our capacity is still fossil fuel based, and Ireland as a whole is still very much fossil fuel based. About 25% of our capacity is renewables and storage in the form of pumped hydro and batteries. So that's the context. That's where we're coming from as a business. Our strategy, a lot on this slide, so apologies. But our vision is driven to make a difference, net zero by 2040. So we got a new CEO in 2020, and his new vision for the company, for the group as a whole, was to achieve net zero by 2040. And so that's very much our North Star. That's what we're aiming for, and we're trying to make sure that we can deliver that. And that comes across 3 pillars across the middle of that slide there that you can see: decarbonized electricity, resilient infrastructure, and empowered customers. And 2 of those really relate to our generation business. So decarbonizing electricity, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. That is very much taking our existing electricity system and generating electricity without emissions. Resilient infrastructure probably more naturally sits with a networks business, but it's also for us a little bit about the security of supply and ensuring that we have a stable system that can operate and keep the lights on. Because I suppose I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, ESB is 97% state-owned still. So we operate in a deregulated market, but we answer to our shareholder. And it's bad for politics and bad for re-election when the lights go out. So there is a very important resilient infrastructure aspect to that. So focusing on those 2 aspects, I think, from a decarbonization journey for ESB. But I think, as I said at the beginning, just to tie that back to the Irish context. So how does Ireland decarbonize, and where are we at the moment? So we've made some really good progress. So 2005, only 7% of Irish generation came from renewable sources. Very heavily gas, coal, peat. That was kind of traditionally what we had and what we used. To where that got to in 2022 and 2023 is quite a similar picture. About just over half is still fossil fuel based, but we're up to about 40% of renewable penetration. And that's on an average basis. And the other, I suppose, really interesting thing from an Irish perspective is that our renewables penetration, our peak renewables penetration, or system non-synchronous penetration, SNSP, can get up to 75% now on a stable basis, which for a largely non-interconnected system is very high. And so it's really pushing the boundaries there. And EGRID, I know, like pushing to get that up to 95% by 2030. So really pushing for large-scale penetration of renewables. That's where we are. There are very ambitious goals at a government level to get us further. So onshore wind capacity currently about 6 gigs on the island, target of about 11 by 2030, so another 5 gigs in 6 years. For solar, we're at about 1 gig. In fact, a lot of fanfare made recently that ESB Networks recently connected its 1,000th megawatt of solar onto the network. There's a plan for 9 gigs by 2030, so really aggressive there. Onshore wind, still a huge target of 8 gigawatts by 2030. That rhetoric has changed a little bit to being 8 gigawatts in development by 2030, so the target is softening a bit, and I think everybody realizes that one's pretty unlikely to happen. And then a target on renewable penetration. So from the 37, 39% where we are at the moment, getting to about 80% by 2030. So really, really aggressive targets. There is also a challenge here on the demand side. So demand is growing. 1.6% per annum might not look like a huge amount, but in a system that is transitioning away from fossil fuels towards renewables, that starts to put our capacity adequacy under pressure. And if we look at, this is a slightly different characterization of it, but our peak demand is rising, that's the green line, at the same time as our available capacity from dispatchable plants is declining. And so 2015, 2016, 2017, that was fine. Available capacity under almost all plausible scenarios was available to meet peak demand. And what we've seen over the last few years is that we're really bumping up against that limit of available capacity with limited ability to rely on interconnectors to bail us out. And so that becomes a really major challenge for the system going forward, is not only building out the renewables and those huge goals, but also making sure that the system remains resilient. And the demand is going to continue to grow. So this chart comes from EGRID's generation capacity statement, which they put out every year with a 10-year outlook for what they expect system demand to be in the future. And they put out multiple scenarios. They all go up. even in a low demand scenario. So we've got system adequacy being constrained. We're trying to transform a system, and we've got strong growth in demand. And not surprisingly, and it's a point that comes up all the time, is Ireland and data centers. And the light blue segments there is very much our new large energy users. So a lot of that demand growth is coming from these, effectively, data centers. And one of the, I guess, the greater uncertainties about that is the impact of generative AI on that demand picture. Because depending on who you ask, generative AI versus standard databasing or data search is 5 to 25 times as energy intensive. So we've got the real potential for that demand to grow even faster, and it's a real challenge, the economic development question versus the electricity supply security question, as we want to keep attracting the data centers to Ireland because they bring in economic prosperity, but at the same time, we need to have a way of actually connecting them to a stable electricity system. So in that context of those challenges, what do we see as the kind of components of a net zero system? So we see it as a three-legged stool. There's probably nothing particularly shocking about this. The first one is building out renewables. I think that's fairly standard. We want to build more renewables to displace fossil fuels. But crucially, we also need dispatchable generation, and we need quite a lot of dispatchable generation. We need that capacity adequacy. We need to be able to keep the lights on when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that's a really key pillar, and the whole thing is very much tied together by the storage and the system services. So being able to store energy for when we need it, to use net zero energy in dispatchable generation, and also to provide the system services to keep the system stable. So what does that mean in the context of Ireland from a scale perspective? And again, I highlight that these numbers look big and scary to us. They might not to everybody in the room, but we think that the Irish system needs north of 30 gigawatts of renewables in a net zero system. We're not necessarily saying when. We currently got about 7 gigs. So that's 4 to 8 times the scale. Big enough challenge. We're building out to that. That's going to require us to keep developing onshore wind, offshore wind, floating offshore wind at scale and other technologies. On dispatchable generation, we need more than 10 gigawatts. So peak load is going up from about 7 gigawatts now to about 10, 11, depending on 12, depending on who you ask. So we need that backup dispatchable generation. We've got about 7 gigs of capacity at the moment, but not all of it is transferable or able to go on a net zero pathway. So there's a real transformation of that dispatchable generation. We think that hydrogen is a critical part of the long-term net zero system in Ireland, and our estimation is that we need about 10 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity. So that's renewable power powering hydrogen manufacture. So that's effectively electrolysis, starting from a base of 0 today. And we need about 5 to 10 terawatt hours of storage, again, depending on which model you look at, against what we have at the moment, about 2.5 gigawatt hours, 2,000 to 5,000 times what we have at the moment. So it's a massive scale up of storage, and also going from short duration storage is what we have at the moment, 2 hours, 4 hours on our one pumped hydro scheme, going up to much longer duration storage, up to the 100-hour level, and then with hydrogen up to the interseasonal storage. Because as we electrify things, our seasonal demand profile will vary greatly, and so we're going to need to be able to produce very different levels of electricity at different times of year. So that long duration storage is very much required as part of the system. So that sets us up for what the Irish system kind of needs to look like to deliver on net zero. So switching back to ESB and where we are today, and this is our emissions profile. So we emitted about 11.7 million tons of CO2 in 2022. It dropped a bit in 2023, along with our generation. What you can see from that is that it is right across the supply chain. So from upstream emissions on the left, upstream emissions associated with fuel that we either burn ourselves or sell to customers for them to burn, electricity generation, transmission and distribution, and then the scope 3 on the far right-hand side is very much gas that we supply to our customers for heating. And that's also a large component. But our net zero journey is very much focused on the 62% of those emissions that are electricity generation, so directly from burning fuel in our power plants. And so that's very much that's very much the focus, and that's of what we're trying to get to. What that means, though, is as a company, we need to get ourselves onto this glide path. We need to get ourselves onto the trajectory towards net zero by 2040. Bruce talked about getting yourself close and then understanding, kind of the resistance as the cost of that last 5 or 10% starts to go up. We acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that that last 10% is a massive challenge, but we need to give ourselves a chance of getting there. And so our strategy is very much focused on how do we get onto this pathway as a group, so as an overall company, and critically then from a generation perspective, and this is our emissions intensity of generation, how do we get ourselves on that pathway towards 0 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour by 2040? We got down from about 670 in 2005 when the European ETS first required us to measure it, down to 370 last year. So that's a 45% drop. So we've made fantastic progress. But obviously that decline only needs to accelerate out to 2030 to a target that we've set for ourselves of 140 grams of CO2 by 2030, and then onwards towards zero by 2040. So in the short term, our strategy is fairly clear. The short term being to 2030, it's a fairly short period of time. What we need to deliver is effectively more renewables in this context. And so our pathway towards 2030 is 500 gigawatts, that's a lot. 500 megawatts of additional renewables and storage every year out to 2030 to get to the target we've set ourselves of 5,000 megawatts of renewables and storage by 2030, from where we are today at about 1.4 gigawatts. So even that, we know the pathway. We've got the projects identified. We've got the CapEx assigned. It's an ongoing debate. But there is a pathway to get there, very aggressive, and that can happen somewhat independently of the system. If we build that out, we can get ourselves onto that pathway to have a chance of getting to net zero by 2040. But the big challenge then becomes longer term. What do we actually invest in? And this is, I guess, where we kind of get down to the crux of it and the requirements of good models to help us do this. Because if we look at our options longer term, and this is very much non-exhaustive, but if we go and look at all of the technologies that we could potentially look at, and all of the geographies we could operate in, so the 3 geographies we already operate in, are there others? Ireland's going to be more interconnected in future. Should we look at Spain? Should we look at France? All of the actions we could take with each of those technologies, we very quickly get to over 1,000 possibilities. So that's almost an impossible task to figure out what are the priorities here, how do they interact with each other. First step, and sorry that popped up earlier, is how do we filter fast? So starting off with a real kind of brutal assessment of each of them and being realistic and saying, we're a medium-sized electricity utility. We can't go after all these things. It's just not practical. We have to identify what can genuinely make an impact by 2040 and go after those. And so the first part of that is a really fairly simple filter, is what's the impact that a technology can have and how doable is it? Is it something that we can actually realistically do as ESB? And what we're trying to do is identify the high potential options. So what is going to have an impact? What do we want to do? What do we actually think we can do? And what is realistically doable by 2040? So that's the first step in identifying what we want to do. Of course, there are a lot of blockers along the way. So things that are making this really hard in the context of our plan and our strategy. And the first one is policy. Policy is trying to keep up. There's an awful lot of policy being delivered and being developed. It's not necessarily always aligned, so we're trying to, and you're also trying to anticipate future policy. So this kind of policy is a real challenge, trying to make investment decisions with really uncertain rules in the future. And that's obviously something that's ongoing, and that work is ongoing, and a lot of great policy is being developed. But in such a changing system, that's always going to be a massive uncertainty. Planning is a huge problem. I think planning is a problem anywhere, getting stuff built. So there was a period there leading up to the middle of last year where there was the best part of 18 months when not a single wind farm was approved in Ireland. And so getting planning permission is a massive challenge. To building out at this scale, we really need the planning system to come with us. Grid comes up all the time. Obviously, as we build out these renewables, we're going to need more grid in different places. One of the huge challenges of this is we obviously keep pushing for anticipatory grid development, saying we need to develop the grid now so that it can facilitate these renewables, but at the same time, we want to develop a led system where we decide where we put our renewables. So it does put the TSO in a slightly awkward position of going, well, okay, we can plan to build out the grid, but we don't want to tell you where to put your capacity. So you've got that kind of chicken and egg situation on grid, and then obviously also the massive challenge of actually building stuff, building surface infrastructure in the current environment. And then supply chain has its ups and downs, but it's only going to, as renewables scale up and as all these technologies scale up, getting access to the supply chain, avoiding cost inflation, and being able to actually deliver on the timeline that you're planning is obviously a massive challenge. And if EWEC is, for example, going to be adding 5 gigawatts by 2027, then that's going to strain the supply chain as well. So it's those sorts of decisions. So we've got all of that to contend with, and then we've got the distortions in the market. So we've got a really kind of changing market. So it used to be relatively simple. You had this is kind of the Irish system, but a marginal cost dispatch curve where the bids met the offers. That's where the market cleared, and off we went. And it does work to that extent, sort of, still, but we've got all sorts of market distortions that are being introduced to try and help us drive this transition. So the first one is building renewables in Ireland doesn't happen without a contract for difference from the government or a corporate PPA, which the CPPAs, we can come back to the data centers maybe in a discussion a bit later. But that absolutely distorts the market. That capacity adequacy that we talked about and having to incentivize capacity to be available when we need it, but obviously there's no energy revenue, or we don't want energy revenue from that capacity. So how do we design that system so that we've got enough capacity? That's another distortion in the market. And then you've got other ones. System services being redesigned at the moment. How do we make sure that we've got all of those ancillary services that we need? How do we contract them and run auctions for them and make sure that all works? Then we're going to have long-duration energy storage. What are the market's signals for that long-duration energy storage to actually get built? Do we need to design that? We've also got low-carbon inertia services, which is essentially sync comps or synchronous compensators or condensers being built. So we've got all of this massive complexity that we're trying to understand what we should be doing, where we should be investing within the context of all of this. And this is where it's kind of vital that the modeling comes in and the modeling comes with us, because we look at the old school, and we had, as I said, gas, peat, oil as well, and coal. It was pretty straightforward. How it operated was pretty straightforward. There was, obviously, you still wanted to model the outputs and make strategic decisions, but the complexity was really relatively low, so the uncertainty was relatively low. And what we're seeing now, obviously, is the complexity is ramping up of this whole system, and all of these interacting elements and distortions in the system, and the uncertainty goes up. And where we're going in the future is more complexity and more uncertainty. So that just makes it massively challenging to know what should we do. And so our modeling team looks at the world and distills it down to two axes: the speed of decarbonization and the speed of system transformation. And so effectively what that gives you is a slow, a medium, and a rapid transition towards net zero. And they try and factor in all of these different components of how do we consider how the different policy is going to, and how grid availability is going to affect the economics of the different elements that we're considering. So, for example, CCGTs in our modest progression view, you see lower running or lower capacity factor of CCGTs out into the future. So how does that affect the economics of CCGTs? Would you ever build another one? But then also you've got increasing constraints on renewables as you build them out, and you've got grid constraints. So that becomes a challenge as well. So you're really trying to use ever more sophisticated models to unpick all of this complexity and come up with what we hope are sensible and rational decisions. So don't want to go into the specifics, but we believe it is necessary to invest across that three-legged stool. So our strategy does include building more wind and solar and pursuing that. And a lot of those projects have got long lead times, and we're going to continue pushing on that to build that out as fast as we can to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and onwards to 2040. We do think we have a massive role in providing dispatchable capacity to this future system, partly because of our installed base. So we do have a large installed base of dispatchable capacity that we are actively developing strategies to transition to net zero fuels. So we think that is and also we have the grid access at those points. So it's really vital that we continue to provide those services and to provide the capacity. But there's also a really important element of developing these flexible technologies that can keep the grid stable and understanding the economics of those and using the outputs of our models and our scenarios that we run to understand the relative importance of these and the locational signals that come with our models. And finally, we believe hydrogen has a massive role to play. There isn't any hydrogen to speak of in Ireland at the moment, so we continue to work on the proof of concept of hydrogen. So we have purchased some fuel cells. We're committed to doing a demonstrator on an electrolyzer as well. And our ultimate goal is on the right-hand side is very much these hubs or these energy hubs where we can combine industrial demand, renewable energy landing, so offshore renewable energy landing at that point, hydrogen generation, hydrogen storage. In this example, we're proposing the depleted Kinsale gas field off the south coast of Cork in the south of Ireland, and so limiting the need to build out this massive infrastructure by co-locating as much as possible and looking at energy hubs in future. So our strategy is offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, proving out hydrogen's case, dispatchable net zero plant, providing the grid services, and then also we are evaluating other new technologies, the ones that can really have an impact over and above what we've already got in our pipeline and considering where else we could go. So just to conclude then, we've got a vision for delivering net zero. We also have a vision for continuing to support the development and decarbonization of the Irish economy as a whole. That is a whole system process. And so we very much look at our strategy in the context of it is a whole of system process. But it's becoming so complex to understand how this all is going to work. So we need to get better and better at handling that complexity, understanding that complexity, being able to model it and quantify the risks associated with potential decisions to let us make the best possible decisions. And so we need more and more sophisticated models. The tools like Plexos are absolutely invaluable to us developing our long-term strategy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. And I'm sure the room is bursting with very great questions. So any takers? There's one in the back, yes?
Hello, Juhani Riikonen from Flexens. Many thanks for a really interesting presentation. In the end, you mentioned the plans about the hydrogen hubs. So do you want to open a bit like what kind of sizes or capacities are you targeting with these hubs?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's still very much it's a conceptual element at the moment. I mean, as that picture actually is of our first fuel cell. It's a one megawatt fuel cell. So it's fairly early days. But we're looking at the scale. So the scale there is sort of potentially the offshore wind there is a couple of gigawatts. And so you're largely trying to use, obviously you want to use that energy as directly as possible given the efficiency of the hydrogen. So you're probably looking at the hydrogen, and it depends on the different scenarios, but in the kind of hundreds of megawatts sort of range to be able to generate hydrogen. And I suppose the ultimate vision goes beyond just Ireland. So Ireland's sea area or maritime area is 7 times its land area. So, and it's windy. It's the windiest place in Europe. So the argument goes that we can overbuild on the renewables, we can generate the hydrogen, and then we basically are creating hydrogen all roads lead to Berlin. And and that's obviously the dream. But I think initially the aim is in the sort of hundreds of megawatts scale.
I'll just throw in a question, because something which didn't come up, and it's a bit of a hidden champion in Germany, is biogas, and
Yeah.
Ireland is green. They call it the Green Island, and I've heard rumors there are 370 days of rain there. So is that coming up? Is that a lever?
Yeah, people tend to say their two favorite days of the year are Christmas and summer. Yeah, biogas is coming. It's so there is a biogas strategy that is in the process of being consulted on and released, and the aim is about 6 terawatt hours. I think it's 5.7 terawatt hours of biogas energy by 2030, in a system that's about 50 odd terawatt hours. The gas system is about 50 terawatt hours, but the challenge is that it's it's green, but it's also most of the farming is outdoors, so we don't have the intensity of a waste production that, say, Denmark has. So being able to generate large volumes of biogas is a challenge for Ireland. So there is more capacity than maybe 6 terawatt hours, but I think the estimate of the total system potential is about 12 terawatt hours. Okay. So it's not going to replace natural gas, but it is absolutely intended to be a supplement to the system.
Okay, thank you. Bruce.
Roger, you talked about multiple gigawatts of solar and wind needing to be developed by 2030, and almost in the next breath said projects are all delayed, it takes years to get a single project delivered, transmission is lagging behind. How feasible is it, this aspiration to hit your 2030 targets, and obviously 2040 is looming not far behind?
Should we go plausible? Is that it is a massive challenge.
You're among friends here.
Yeah.
So.
It is a massive challenge. I think it is a huge risk. We consistently see, if we take our unrisked pipeline and we go back 5 years and we looked at our project pipeline, how much are we going to deliver in the next 5 years, and what did we deliver? They're very different numbers. I think it's a huge challenge. Solar probably facing fewer barriers, so there is a lot more potential for us to add solar, partly because we're starting from such a low base. So there really isn't a lot of utility-scale solar in Ireland. Is 400 megawatts or something.
Is 1 day a year load factor enough to make solar work?
Okay, don't laugh. But in the sunny southeast, it can manage about a 12% capacity factor. What do you get?
33.
Right. Yes, so it is, but it is also. I guess you talked about your system getting more expensive and getting up towards 100, sort of 100 euros or $100 a megawatt hour, and we're kind of already there. So solar does make sense in that context. But building it, yes, it's a challenge. I think solar, we've got a shot at it. Wind is very challenging, and I think our strategy does also involve acquisitions. So there is obviously the question of additionality, and everybody wants to see additionality as we build out these renewables. But yes, we are all competing for a pie that isn't growing as fast as we would like it to. So I think that those challenges that I talked about, the grid policy, supply chain challenges, need to be. We need to see improvements there to be able to have a realistic chance of delivering this over the time frame we're aiming at.
Perfect. So one more question here. The left side of the room or your right is very quiet today.
Sorry,
so I'm going to pick on one. So,
Tom Edwards from Cornwall Insight. You mentioned the very stretching policy goals from Ireland, but GB also has very stretching policy goals. If GB achieves its ambitions, do you believe that would swamp the Irish ability to meet theirs? And how do you account for that in terms of where you should invest, given GB has a more developed offshore industry?
Yeah, so I suppose the short answer is we kind of hedge our bets a little bit. So we are active in GB, and onshore wind portfolio in GB is currently moving faster than our onshore wind portfolio in Ireland. And obviously, offshore wind, we're actively developing projects off Scotland as well. Yes, it is something that we are actively tracking, and I think it's probably fair to say that certainly in offshore renewables, GB is fairly significantly ahead of where Ireland is. It's the potential in Ireland that keeps us excited at being able to build that out at scale, but it is a longer term play. That's well into the 2030s, where we're going to be delivering megawatts in GB this year. So they combine. I was talking about Ireland. Our view is that if we manage to build it out in GB and we're building additional interconnection, that does benefit Ireland still. So we're somewhat agnostic on kind of where it happens as long as it happens.
Perfect. So I think we have time for one more question. I see one hand there in the back.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I'm Sean Collins from IRENA, and you mentioned the raising of the SNSP penetration in Ireland. This is a very large challenge. And what will the implications for that be for the power system and for system inertia going forward in increasing this to 95%? And what would the role of synthetic inertia be there, possibly?
I think you're going a little bit beyond my technical knowledge there.
Perhaps you need to ask some colleagues from EirGrid who are in the room.
Well, I suppose that's a fair point. Yes, we could if anybody from EirGrid wants to jump on that one. But obviously it is a big challenge, and that's part of the reason that Ireland is such an interesting case study, is because it is leading the way on this. And I know that EirGrid is working incredibly hard to keep the system stable as it incrementally ramps up and runs trials at 5% higher and 5% higher. To ultimately be able to change the maximum limit. I'm not sure on synchronous inertia, but it's not. If we get up to a 95 or 100% system, there's no ways that can all be physical inertia. You can't have spinning bits of steel. If you can't keep bits of steel spinning everywhere to give that system stability, there needs to be grid forming capability on our renewables. There needs to be synthetic inertia coming from other kind of static storage devices and things. So I don't quite know how that works. I do appreciate the work that EirGrid is doing to get that number up and make sure that the system is stable. And it is one of the targets that is being routinely hit as we move through this whole process. So I actually would be very interested to maybe discuss that point at 95% and 100%, what the plans are.
Okay. Perfect. Well then, thank you again, Roger.
Well, thank you.